In this story, I'm going to tell you how I reclaimed my career after a magnetic manager spent months erasing my work and turning the team against me. But get this, I didn't quit, sue, or lash out. I quietly built a timestamped dossier, emails, screenshots, calendar invites, and walked into a 15-minute meeting and let the facts do the talking. What happened next, the way the company had to face the truth and the unexpected, clean revenge that followed, is something you won't see coming. My name is Evelyn Hartman, but most people call me Ev. I am 34, I live in Portland, Oregon, and I work in a small design studio that makes websites for local businesses. I have a calm voice and a quiet way of moving through the world, the kind of person who notices the light in a bookstore window, the curl of steam above a mug, the way rain smooths the edges of the city. I like rainy walks, old bookstores with narrow aisles and dog-eared type, and the little coffee shop on Southeast that knows my order before I even ask. I care about craft, I care about clear typography and good user flows. I am kind, careful, and good at my job. If you met me at a party, you might forget me later. I do not demand the spotlight. I preferred it that way for most of my life. For years, I kept my head down at the studio. I did excellent work, met deadlines, and tried to be a team player. I believed in fairness, in merit, in people doing the right thing. I believed, stupidly perhaps, that consistent competence would speak loudest in the end. It was a modest faith, but it was mine. Then Mara became my manager. Mara arrived like weather, sudden, charismatic, all-consuming. She had the kind of confidence that makes a room tilt toward her. People laughed when she laughed. Clients took notes when she spoke. She wore a jacket that always seemed to be cut perfectly for her shoulders. She used broad strokes of rhetoric that made uncertainty dissolve into decisions. At first, I thought she would be a great leader. I told myself anyone who could gather that kind of attention had to be useful. But the change that followed was slow and surgical, like frost nibbling away at a window pane. Her undermining started with small things. An email left out of a chain here, a meeting scheduled at the last minute where she praised a version of an idea I had drafted. The incidents were each small enough to be brushed aside, but taken together day after day, they began to feel like a tightening noose. She excluded me from project briefs that were clearly in my domain. She pushed me off client calls I had arranged, suddenly asserting that she would lead the conversation. She began giving me impossible deadlines for work she herself had delayed. In meetings, she corrected me in a tone that made the team look at me as if I had somehow failed them. People began to look at me the way one sees a painting someone else has altered, confused and a little suspicious, wondering which hand had done the touching. When I asked Mara what was happening, she smiled with the kind of small, almost pitying expression reserved for someone who thinks the world is a child's puzzle. "You're being sensitive," she told me. When I took the issue to HR muttered about conflict resolution and scheduled a mediation. The mediation turned out to be a performance coaching session that read my actions as part of an attitude problem. I left feeling blamed for being blamable. My pay stagnated while others, some with less experience, were promoted. A promotion I had worked toward and earned in results went to someone who had joined after me and who had loudly championed ideas I had drafted. I began to dread Mondays. I started waking up at night, heart racing, slicing and replaying small conversations, looking for the angle where I had gone wrong. The thing that made it especially cruel was that I had no proof that Mara was deliberately sabotaging me. It was my word against her tone, my exhaustion against her charm. I tried every reasonable response I could imagine. I tried to be patient. I tried to be better. I tried to document everything as if keeping a diary of slights would somehow make them legible to others. I asked her directly, the way I used to talk to people, calm, fair, and concrete. She smiled and told me to trust the team. When I went to HR and filed formal complaints, I received notes about mediation and suggestions about improving my communication style. One of the worst encounters was when my supervisor, looking away at a spreadsheet, gave me an abstracted, corporate nod and told me they appreciated my contributions while doing nothing of real consequence. As if that were not enough, the social fabric at the office began to fray around me. People I had always eaten lunch with stopped inviting me. Casual desk conversations thinned into silences when I approached. At one client meeting I had arranged, Mara interrupted me mid-sentence, rephrased my point in a way that made me sound inexperienced, then later sent a glowing follow-up email that implied she had authored the revised pitch. I recorded the episode in my head and replayed it until the edges blurred with fatigue. I asked for a transfer. The paperwork was delayed until the project that was supposed to move me was quietly canceled. When I mentioned promotion possibilities to another manager, she suggested, gently, as if tucking me into a softer bed, that I might be happier in a different role. Each small administrative rebuff felt like a hinge closing. The worst night came after a studio-wide review. Mara publicly criticized my communication style in front of everyone, then privately messaged me praise for showing up. The gulf between the two gestures was a kind of dissolution. It left me raw. That night I lay awake and felt a hollowness open inside me. I pictured moving away, starting over someplace no one knew my name. I considered quitting and nearly did. The insomnia grew teeth. I could not sleep or eat. My dreams were full of small betrayals and doors closing behind me. And yet when I emptied the panic from my chest and looked more closely at the pattern, I noticed something else besides the cruelty. I noticed traceable threads. Mara had a way of retelling meetings later as though she had been the originator of ideas the team had discussed collectively. She cultivated a group within the studio, praise here, small perks there, an attentive ear in private that built loyalty. She moved pieces on the chessboard without showing the hand that worked them. These were not single offenses, but a method. A trusted senior colleague, someone who had navigated management storms longer than I had, read through a few of my saved messages and frowned. He told me quietly that he had seen similar patterns before, but never to this degree. He said I should make hard copies and consult an employment lawyer if I intended to pursue anything formal. I did not want a court fight. I wanted something less destructive but equally clear: truth. Then came the final collapse. A promising client, the sort of contract that could reshape our small studio's prospects, canceled, citing a lack of confidence in the account team. Externally, they blamed the studio's organization. Internally, I knew the real reason. Mara had been quietly undermining my client management, hinting over dinner that perhaps I was not the best fit. When the cancellation landed, the office bristled with blame. People gestured toward one another. Mara looked wounded and disappointed, impeccably hurt. No one thought to ask me for the email trail that showed I had repeatedly warned the team about scope and risk. For a while I considered the simplest revenge: quit, walk away, and never speak of it again. To burn the bridge might have been satisfying in its finality, but it would have been a surrender, acceptance that the story had been rewritten and I had nothing to do about it. I wanted something different. I wanted the truth to be visible, undeniable, and to be heard without my emotions being the focus. I wanted to use facts. So I began to gather evidence, not as an act of vengeance in the melodramatic sense, but as a methodical rescue of my own narrative. I saved every email and calendar invite that showed who had conceived ideas, who had scheduled calls, who had approved drafts. I took screenshots of messages where my contributions were erased or reassigned. I started a private log, dated and time-stamped, that described each incident in a sober voice and listed witnesses. My notes were precise, clinical even: dates, times, the sequence of messages. I stopped trusting casual praise and began to assume that any public credit could be questioned against a record. As the file grew, a pattern emerged that hurt but also clarified what had been happening. I could trace idea migrations, drafts that began as my sketches and ended up credited to others. I could map client communications against the timeline of meetings and show where important warnings had been raised and ignored. I included notes about how Mara cultivated a certain group through flattery and selective access, a pattern that explained why people seemed quick to side with her even when the facts did not support the story. One night, a senior colleague leaned over my shoulder and said softly, "This level of documentation will make it hard to dismiss you." It felt almost indecently empowering. The plan I sketched for myself was simple and surgical: create a presentation that told the studio the timeline of our most important recent projects with facts, timestamped messages, emails, and screenshots. It would be framed not as accusation but as clarification, a record of what happened so the company could learn and improve. If the goal was truth rather than revenge, the method had to be clean. I spent nights building the file. I organized it by date, by project, by client. For each public claim I attached primary evidence: the original email that proposed a concept, the calendar invite showing who scheduled the call, the message thread where a client accepted a deliverable. I annotated screenshots with brief notes. I traced scope warnings to later client complaints and mapped out the causal lines as a courtroom map might show the path from cause to consequence. I rehearsed presenting calmly, practiced how to say each sentence without the tremor of accusation. The night before the all-hands, I went home with a stomach full of something that felt like fear wrapped in anticipation. I considered sending the folder to the CEO or HR and letting them rip through it in private, but I wanted the evidence to live in the light. I wanted the team to see the facts unmediated by rumor. In the morning, I walked into the studio earlier than usual and asked for 15 minutes at the weekly all-hands. I did not mention Mara in the request. I wanted no time for crafted counter-narrative. When the meeting began, I connected my laptop and asked everyone to look at the screen. My voice was steady in a way that surprised me. I said it would be factual and brief and that I loved the studio and wanted it to be better. Then I walked them through the timeline. When I said a date, I showed the message that proved it. When I said an idea had come from me on a certain day, I opened the original email draft. I laid out the client emails that praised particular work alongside the earlier threads that showed concerns I had raised about scope. I limited my language to facts, dates, messages, times, because facts are less easy to twist. At first, the room listened in that quiet, concentrated way rooms do when someone decides they will no longer remain small. People shifted, faces changed color as the evidence accumulated. Mara sat with a smile that thinned as slide after slide made assertions that did not line up with the story she had told. Her protector and upper management sat very still. The chief executive leaned forward, eyes narrow. HR, obliged by procedure, asked me for a copy of the folder. A few people came to me after and said, quietly, that they had seen similar things and were glad someone had gathered the record. Mara left the room quickly and did not return for a while. The company opened an investigation because it had to. I was nervous. I had risked exposing more than I intended and worried about retaliation. But the evidence was thorough and dated. People could not unsee it. HR interviewed witnesses, traced emails, and confronted the uncomfortable match between public praise and private records. The investigation could not paint the whole thing as misunderstanding. Patterns were patterns. The result was not dramatic in a cinematic way. There was no tirade, no explosive public shaming. The company chose a path that minimized legal exposure but forced accountability. Mara received a formal reprimand, was moved into a role that kept her away from direct team management, and was enrolled in leadership retraining and coaching. Her protector and upper management had to answer difficult questions about missed signs. The studio implemented a transparent project tracking system and began crediting contributors explicitly in client communications. It was bureaucratic, procedural, and effective. For me, the real revenge was not humiliation. It was the restoration of truth and my sense of agency. I had been so quiet for so long that when I finally used facts to speak, my voice came back. People who had been distant began to engage with me again, asking about projects and soliciting my ideas. The promotion offered months later came not because I demanded it, but because the record of my work made it impossible to ignore. The salary mattered, but more than money was the message. I belonged. The ending was not violent or theatrical. It was practical and in its way poetic. I did not destroy Mara. I did not seek to ruin her life. I exposed a pattern and insisted on clarity within a system that had been happy to let things slide. In the months that followed, I slept again. The replayed betrayals still visited at times, but less often. I developed a habit of documenting contributions as a form of self-preservation rather than paranoia. I learned that patience alone is not justice, but careful, principled action can be. If there is a twist, it arrived a year later in an email from Mara, clumsy and unexpectedly sincere. She said she had been fighting insecurities, that she recognized how she had pushed people away, and asked if we could meet for coffee. I did not reply immediately. I thought about the weeks of sleeplessness, the friendships that frayed, and the life I had almost ceded to quiet defeat. I also thought about the small satisfaction that came from creating a record that could not be dismissed. When I finally wrote back and agreed to coffee, Mara arrived looking different, softer around the edges, tired and human. We spoke about leadership, about how certain behaviors are learned and sometimes unlearned. I did not forget what had happened, but I did not carry the grievance like a stone in my pocket. My revenge had been precise and fair. I reclaimed my story, and in reclaiming it, I reclaimed myself.